In our last lesson, we looked at what a professional composer's training should include in terms of craftsmanship. Once a composer has reached a professional level of craftsmanship, the next step is to try and discover their own voice. They may have already begun during their previous training, but a composer who aims to be the best that they can be will also try to develop their own personal style. It's important to note that one's own style is not just an intellectual decision, but rather a process of discovery. It has mainly to do with the composer's preferences and all the various musical dimensions. Many composers start off by imitating other composers who preceded them. This is normal, since any serious musician starts off by falling in love with someone else's music, usually when they're very young. It's natural to try and imitate what we admire, at least at first. However, as we mature and explore musical craftsmanship, inevitably we discover things we didn't know, and we also notice things we like more than others. For example, I have taught modern harmony many times, but I don't like clusters and serial harmony. I know how to do these things, but you'll never find them in my own music. Linear harmony, on the other hand, is everywhere in my music. It's important here to focus on the role of the composition teacher. Teachers who direct all their students to certain styles that are fashionable at the moment are not doing their job. Like all fashions, musical fashions change. So, students who were told that all new music had to be serial, and this was the case at a certain time, now find that nobody is interested in writing serial music anymore. What the teacher should be doing is to notice specific technical preferences in each student and point them out, while simultaneously providing the student with useful practical advice on how to achieve their goals more efficiently. In other words, the teacher's focus should be on craftsmanship, not style. Incidentally, these preferences are not mainly about what you avoid, for example, clusters in my case, because nobody listens to music for what isn't there. Specific preferences for each composer fall into one or more of these categories. Genre. Nobody associates Wagner with piano music or Chopin with opera. Timbre and orchestration. Apart from composers who only favor one or two instruments, the technique of orchestration can be quite different between composers. For example, Tchaikovsky versus Wagner. Both are wonderful orchestrators, but their respective styles of orchestration are very different. Harmony. Apart from the norms at any given time, composers often show a marked preference for distinctive kinds of harmony. For example, Wagner is mostly chromatic, and Hindemith uses lots of harmony by fourths. Texture. Some composers favor more contrapuntal textures, like Bach. Others write mostly homophonic music, like Schumann. Form. Beethoven wrote most of his larger works in sonata form, including his symphonies, whereas, say, Hugo Wolf favored lieder. Dynamic surprises, transitions, different kinds of development, all these can be typical of a composer's style. Let's look at a few well-known examples of composer styles in more detail. The examples I've chosen are all very well known. One can usually recognize the composer within a minute or two. Here's the Nocturne, Opus 48, No. 1 by Chopin. Chopin wrote mainly for piano. If we look at the texture here, we see a melody with more and more ornamentation in the upper part. Note the very ornate phrase just before the main cadence of this section of the piece. This is typical of operatic writing at that time. The singer is in the foreground and their virtuosity is on display. Chopin's textures are often operatic like this, with elaborate, ornate melodic lines accompanied by simpler background figuration. His harmony is diatonic, but with important moments underlined by chromaticism. Again, noticed in the Neapolitan sixth chord in the last phrase. His forms are often fairly small and focused on melodic development. Our next example is Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata, the beginning of the first movement. Notice the quiet, mysterious beginning. Then Beethoven repeats it in G-flat major. This kind of chromaticism at the start of a piece was quite rare at that time. Then in measure 9 a new motive is introduced in the low register. In measures 11 and 12 Beethoven focuses only on this new motive. We get a sense that something new is coming, but we have no clear idea what it would be. Then, suddenly the music explodes in a wild diminished seventh arpeggio, landing on an equally abrupt half cadence in measure 15. Notice how the two chords aren't in the same dynamic. The first is loud and the second one is quiet. And then, yet another surprise. The music seems to be restarting, but the opening phrase is now interrupted by the fortissimo F minor chords moving up in register. In this passage there are many things that often characterize Beethoven's music. First, the wide range of the piano writing, with lots of very varied figuration. Beethoven orchestrates for the piano in novel ways. Even more typical is the way he uses sudden dynamic surprises, how they are always followed up. One sudden dynamic is already surprising, but each of the sudden changes has some kind of consequence in the following bars. Beethoven often explored abrupt dynamic changes like this, and they widened the emotional range of the music considerably. Debussy's La Cathédrale Engloutie is one of his best-known works, and it perfectly exemplifies his style. This piece is supposed to sound like bells underwater, and Debussy uses the piano pedal to create long waves of sound. This allows him to use all the piano registers at the same time, for example in measure 1, where the outer parts continue to resonate while the chords in the middle register climb up. Then in measure 2, we have the low register alone. Here too, the overall result is more a cloud of sound than a melody. In measure 6 and following there is a melody, but within it the repeated E provides another bell-like pedal effect. So this is not a typical melody and accompaniment, but again, playing with resonance to suggest large spaces in water. In the passage starting here, the same idea is developed with richer chords and a more active texture. Again, this is really a kind of orchestration for piano, where one player can suggest multiple planes of tone. Debussy's orchestral music is also like this. It doesn't use counterpoint in the way, say, Mahler often does. Rather, Debussy aims at richness of texture, where a main line is accompanied by rich clouds of sound, with lots of subtle variation of detail. Debussy's preludes, in fact, are wonderful models of piano writing as a kind of orchestration, using the pedal to combine and distinguish multiple planes of tone. Harmonically, the parallel fifths at the start are also very typical of Debussy. They aren't mistakes, as they would be in classical harmony, just the harmony here is consistent. Rather, they give the music kind of transparency that fuller harmonies would not. Later in the piece, there are parallel full chords, but even here, the effect is of a thickening of the texture rather than real counterpoint. Note also the modal harmony, echoing medieval organum. This has a less powerful sense of direction than classical tonal harmony, which contributes to the music's dreamy character. Now let's look at Wagner's prelude to Tristan und Isolde. By the way, note that this score isn't in the normal order. For example, the horns are written above the bassoons. The first thing that's striking about this excerpt is the extremely slow tempo. Wagner's music in general is unusual in its large time scale. His operas are longer than any proposed before him, and the extremely slow tempo here is chosen deliberately to suggest longing, unrequited love. Apart from the slow tempo, another thing we notice here is the plethora of appoggiaturas. There are practically no measures without them, and these appoggiaturas create powerfully expressive chromatic harmonies very typical of Wagner's style. Even at the point of harmonic arrival, the A major chord is approached by an appoggiatura. Like the tempo, this is a way to suggest longing, unrequited love. The bass at the cadence here finally has a clear lip of a fifth, unlike most of what comes before, which is usually stepwise. This kind of harmonic exploration is typical of Wagner. It foreshadows what I call linear harmony, which becomes very important for the composers who followed Wagner. Another typical aspect of Wagner's style is the orchestration. It's rather contrapuntal, not in the sense of imitation or fugue, but rather in the way even secondary instruments have real lines instead of just filler. As an example, look at the horns and woodwind or the lower part of the viola divisi. Wagner was known for this kind of orchestration, which was not always the case in other composers of that time. fact, Richard Strauss, in the introduction to his revision of the Berlioz orchestration treatise, mentions it as a new road in thinking for orchestra, a way to give even the secondary players a feeling of really participating in the spirit of the music. The last composer whose style we'll look at here is Bach. Bach never wrote an opera, but he did write lots of religious music, cantatas, masses, etc. His textures, in all mediums, are always very rich harmonically. Let's look at the Prelude and Fugue in A minor, the Fugue in particular, BWV 543. The performance here is not the best, too metronomic. Unfortunately, the better versions on YouTube all have copyright restrictions. Having played this piece myself, I will always remember it as one of the most intense musical experiences of my life. The fugue starts normally with a very rich subject in A minor. As usual in Bach's fugues, every entry in the exposition is prepared with a rise in expectations. For example, right before the answer, the top line rises to a new peak. This makes the following entry more intense. Notice also how the little episode between the second and third entries is a sequence, but as usual with Bach, it is not mechanical. And, not coincidentally, the music right before the third entry is more intense, with both parts moving in 16th notes. The fugue develops normally after that for a while, although normally for Bach always shows a kind of musical generosity in varying the details and making significant moments stand out, as he did with the first entries. The end of this fugue is of an astonishing intensity. Let's see how Bach achieves it. After a sequence through the circle of fifths, another sequence starts, but now the pedal is in non-stop 16th notes. Soon the bass lands on a short dominant pedal. Then there's another sequence alternating dominant and tonic, followed by another dominant pedal. Throughout this entire passage, the full subject never appears. This is very unusual in a fugue. The reason here is that Bach's preparing a huge climax, and the strong character now is more important than the conventions of a strict fugue. This is first and foremost a piece of powerful dramatic music, and as a composer, Bach pushes it to its limits. After the dominant pedal, there's a cadenza for the pedals, again not at all typical of a fugue, which rises and then falls via a series of poggiaturas into a diminished seventh chord, 7/7 of 5. Then the keyboard returns, now for the first time, in 32nd notes. They ornament the same diminished chord and then arrive at the dominant. The fugue ends with a thick homophonic cadence in the last bar. After all the free figuration of the cadenza, this acts like a powerful resolution. As we can see, Bach was first of all a composer, not a pedantic teacher, always following conventional rules. The extraordinary intensity is typical of his music. Not all composers have such clearly defined styles. The personal voice can be more subtle. Again, this isn't a decision, but just a reflection of the composer's preferences. If a If a composer just tries to imitate some existing style, they may do it very well, but their own voice is usually not evident. Once again, a personal style is not a conscious decision, but rather a gradual discovery of the composer's own preferences.